Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Officer Training School. My name is Joshua Joushi Howard, and today we're going to be talking about another major concept that we got to understand in the Astra Militarum, and that is the trading game. If you are not a guard player, you're welcome to stick around. Of course, everything I talk about in here is stuff that can be translated to other armies. However, we are going to be looking at it primarily from the lens of an Astra Militarum or Imperial Guard player. A lot of what we're going to be talking about is just how to be good at 40k in general. So, we're going to be talking about a couple of different things. To start off, we will talk about what is the trading game? How do we generally approach it? Different ways to approach it with some different lists. I've taken some lists from a couple of my favorite guard players, and we talk a little bit about how they manage to come at it in very different ways. Then we'll go over tools and tips for enabling trades in your favor and trying to use them in order to build an advantage. And lastly, we'll talk about some advanced concepts that we won't go into a lot of detail about, but will hopefully get you at least thinking about how to use this properly. So to start, what is the trading game? At its simplest, the trading game is basically the idea that every time you kill something or score a secondary, the thing that did the killing or the thing that was doing the scoring is probably going to die. And if we have more things or better things, we are going to be able to do more over the course of the game. This, however, goes both ways. If we have to put something out and our opponent can kill it, then we get to shoot back at their thing. But our opponent, of course, also knows this, and so there's this constant give and take in terms of how we actually play on the board. One of the most important things about this is Guard is exceptional at playing the trading game, but it's not necessarily immediately obvious why. So let's go ahead and talk about the different ways that you can be really good at the trading game. In general, you're going to rely on one or more of the following things. We'll go over them in a bit more detail in just a moment. Conceptually, something that you need to understand about the Guard currently in 10th edition, based on the index that we have been playing for the last year and a half, the Guard index is filled with very efficient data sheets. Most of our stratagems are kind of bad, and our enhancements are nothing to write home about either. So we are mostly propped up as a faction by having just really good, efficient data sheets that are fairly aggressively costed. A lot of our units are cheap enough that we can do whatever we want with them. But the question I'll pose to you at the end of this is, what other factions, based on the things that we talk about here, are good at the trading game? So let's go over the first couple of things that we're talking about. So let's start going over different ways that you can be good at the trading game. The first one is you just have less valuable units to trade. You can do this with cheap units to do secondaries like Catachan or Cyclops or Rapier Laser Destroyers, and just have little cheap annoying things to push into your opponent's face such that they have to deal with them. Like we said, things like Catachan and Cyclops are great at this, but also Chimeras and Ogren, because they are so cheap at 70 and 65 points apiece, at least currently, they become very powerful units just because we don't care that much if we lose them. They tend to be a smaller part of our army than anything our opponent is bringing. A slightly different but related idea is having more units. This is generally done via list building. You can kind of get a sense of this just going to the table and just asking your opponent, hey, how many different activations do you have? But if we just have more bishops and knights than they do, we're generally going to have a better time over the course of the game. Everything that we mentioned in the less valuable units is applicable here, but we can also extend this to think about things like the reinforcement stratagem, where whatever unit count we tell our opponent at the beginning of the game, there's actually one more because we're going to be bringing one of those back most of the time. One of the other ways that we can be good at the trading game is just surviving when they try to hit us back. Good ways to do this are generally good defensive profiles or good defensive stratagems. You can be high toughness, have good saves, or have other defensive buffs. Now, if you've already thought about Rogaldorns and Bulgren, that's exactly what I'm talking about. These units are very difficult to destroy, and it's usually going to take our opponent multiple units to try and kill one of these units that we are bringing. And we can supplement this with stratagems like Smokescreen and Armored Might. Beyond just surviving getting traded into, we can prevent our opponent from trading at us quite a bit. A couple of different ways that we can accomplish this are, one, if we kill something in its entirety, it can't do anything anymore because it is dead. So by completely removing certain pieces from our opponent's army, we can protect other parts because now they can't go and shoot or melee any of the things that we were using previously. Other good rules for this are things like Lone Operative, where it takes our opponent a lot of movement just to get in range of some of our lone ops like Gaunt's Ghosts, but we can also do this with things like Indirect Fire. Our opponent can't shoot at our indirect fire if we're firing indirectly as long as we're positioning intelligently. Also, we can use things like out-of-phase moves to hide and make sure that we get to shoot and then prevent our opponents from shooting. So things like Scions that will just completely obliterate our opponent and then be in a position where they are hard to hit. Gaunt's Ghost with Lone Up. Rattlings can jump out, shoot, and then hide. And then Artillery in general are all fantastic examples of not allowing our opponent to trade into us. And then lastly, there are some units that are really good at trading 2 for 1. And this means that they generally are going to be trying to kill multiple things for every one of them that we're going to lose. For a lot of armies, this is something that's going to shoot something off the board and then charge a different thing to kill multiple units. However, it's also true where we can do anything outside of the normal phase where we get to act. So good Overwatch threats are fantastic for this. Scions and Lemanar's battle tanks are two of the best examples at overwatching. You drop Scions in, they kill one thing, but they're also in position to overwatch a second thing, so they're going to get an entire extra activation and potentially kill multiple of our opponent's units. Another way that we can do this is with something like Grey Knight Terminators, where we shoot one thing and then charge another thing in order to kill it. And then one of the best examples of this actually is the Tank Commander. The Tank Commander will get one shooting activation, then it will die when it gets shot back at, and then you get to shoot again. So effectively, you are always going to be trading up with Tank Commanders as long as you get the first shot off from the Tank Commander, because you're almost always going to get your second round of shooting. With these principles in mind, let's go ahead and talk about how two very different lists kind of approach this. The first one is going to be Nick Jagiello's list that he took to CCBB. And you'll notice that there are a ton of activations, a lot of small units in this one. Whereas on the other hand, Robert Moreland taking his Storm Sword and then a bunch of very durable units to his Texas Open. It's important to note here that Robert has 12 activations in his list, whereas Nick's has 19. So let's look at Nick's list a little bit more in depth. To start off with, he took Lord Solar Leontes by himself with no attachments, a Tempestus Command Squad with 5 Scions, a Tank Commander with Grand Strategist, 1 unit of 6 Bulgrin, 2 units of 3, 3 units of 3 Ogren, 1 unit of 5 Scions by themselves, 2 units of 10 Rough Riders, 1 Leman Russ Battle Tank, 1 Leman Russ Exterminator, and then 5 Chimeras with a mixture of Heavy Bolters and Heavy Flamers. When I look at this, I think about this a lot as Nick playing with a lot of Bishops. They're not the best piece in a game of chess, but they're all good pieces. And Nick in general relies on having just more things in the army than his opponent does. And they're all reasonably tough to take out. Ogren, being toughness 6, means they're not going to die very quickly to Lasgun or Bolter Fire. However, by the time you start putting in real firepower, Land Raider is going to pick it up relatively easily. But if a Land Raider is killing 3 Ogren, that means that the Land Raider isn't shooting something else. Nick's list is also rather mobile, so each piece can react to threats elsewhere on the board, and none of these pieces do no damage. There's no piece in here that does crazy damage to anything. However, they're all going to be contributing damage, and so it makes it very flexible how they can move on the board. But the counterpart to this is even though none of these pieces do a ton of damage, no single piece is so valuable that it is game-breaking to lose it. So, depending on what the board situation is, Nick's list is flexible. He can use a unit to do damage, he can use a unit to control space, or he can use a unit to score a secondary because it needs to go somewhere and push a button. So in general, Nick's list is really good at the trading game because you can trade pieces against him, but he's always going to have more pieces than his opponent will if they are trading 1 for 1. And because some of his units are better at dealing with some matchups than others, he gets rid of the units and trades away the units that he doesn't think are as necessary in this particular matchup. Let's contrast this to the list that Robert Moreland took to the Texas Open. He took Gaunt's Ghosts, Lord Solar Leontes with a Platoon Command Squad and a Catachan Squad, 1 Regimental Engineer, 3 units of 6 Bulgrin, 3 Lemanus Exterminators, 1 unit of Rattling Snipers, 1 Storm Sword, and a Calidus. And Robert Moreland's list very much has a queen, to use another chess analogy. The Storm Sword is the most powerful unit on the board in just about every game that it's playing. And it has a huge centerpiece, so it's important to Robert that he makes it very difficult to trade. It's toughness 13, it has a 4-up invul save because of the Regimental Engineer, and it's going to be healing D3 per turn. And as long as it is in cover, it effectively has a 1-up save, so anything with less AP than a Melt-A-Gun is still going to be putting him on a 4-up save at worst. Almost every piece in this army has a 2-up normal save and or a 4-up invul save, and realistically, the lowest toughness that you're going to be going into is toughness 6. So things like Lasguns don't have a lot of things that are effective at actually doing damage to this army. Now, whereas Nick Jagiello generally has an army that doesn't mind if you're trading 1 for 1, Robert Moreland is a list that says, I'm going to try and prevent you from trading back into me. I am too durable, and you're going to have to overcommit to trying to kill any of these 1 things. However, into lists where you can kill the Storm Sword, Robert generally has a little bit tougher time coming back and being a little bit less flexible. It's very hard to do, but if you can do it, it does have a big detriment to the way that his list wants to play. Additionally, whereas Nick Jagiello has a lot of cheap trading pieces like Catachan and Ogren, where he doesn't really mind if they're doing some action off on one part of the board, Robert's list doesn't have that same flexibility. However, both the Gaunt's Ghost and the Calidus, 1 have an up-down, and 2 have lone-op, so they can move into places where a lot of other pieces would die. And this allows Robert Moreland to keep his scoring pieces alive for longer, whereas Nick would trade them for something else. So in general, now that we've accepted that Guard is a very good trading army, and there's different ways to go about it, how do we get a trading game started? Well, the easiest way to do this is to force your opponent to react to something you're doing, especially if you're going first. If you stand on a primary objective with something that you don't care about losing, or is going to survive, so if you put a unit of Catachan or a Chimera or a unit of Bulgrin onto an objective, your opponent oftentimes has to shoot you off of that objective or come and fight you off of it. And in doing so is going to expose pieces in order to shoot you that you can then shoot back. Another thing you can do is you don't necessarily need to stand in a place where you're going to be scoring points, but you can also stand in places where your opponent needs to kill you in order to move. If you string out a unit of Catachan right in front of their tanks, well, they can't move anywhere until they kill you. And because movement happens before shooting, you're going to be holding them back where they can't do anything. But the most important part of this is setting yourself up to kill them back once they kill your first wave of trading pieces. Sometimes we don't need to do anything to get started at all, especially if we're going second. Your opponent is often going to have to do the exact same thing. They're going to expose units to score secondaries or stand on primary objectives, so they can oftentimes start it for you. Now, bear in mind, we usually want to try and kill these. However, if, as an example, we will have to expose a Lehman Russ to kill some cultists, but it'll expose itself to a bunch of incoming las cannon fire, we don't want to trade the Lehman Russ for just these cultists. We generally want to have something cheaper that we can throw out to kill these small units. We don't want our good stuff to die to their good stuff. It's super key to understand where we want to be in order to make sure the trading game is very natural to us. If you watched the previous video about setting up a game plan, understanding how firing lanes operate is going to be super key to making sure that we have good trading opportunities. So we want to understand where we're going to be shot from and where our opponent is going to have to be when they melee us. For our pieces that are going to be doing the killing, we want to stand them near the vertices. Not necessarily immediately on the vertices, but a place where they can move between the different firing lanes such that they can react to anything our opponent does. However, when we're trying to avoid getting traded into, we generally want to stand away from the vertices. We don't want to stand at a place where the lines are intersecting, because it means that we can get shot from multiple different angles, and it's harder for us to manufacture situations where we get to shoot them back. One of the most important things to think about when we're doing this is if our opponent is shooting us in a certain firing line, say they're shooting down the orange firing line, by definition, both of us are now going to be able to see each other. It's simply a matter of making sure that we can move in order to actually get access to them on the firing back. This is why we generally want our units to be standing near these vertices where they can easily move into all these different firing lanes. So we can have shooting units ready to move back into that firing lane to shoot back at whatever just shot down that firing lane. Now let's talk about a couple of practical applications of some of these principles. And remember that these are simply examples, and real games are generally way more complicated than this. This starts off as a pretty normal example. We are forcing our opponent to do something about the fact that we are standing on the middle objective. This is going to score as primary if our opponent does not kill us off of it. However, there are different places that we can stand on this objective in order to make it easier or harder for our opponent to interact with us. So the natural question here, do we want the enemy Bulgrin to be able to melee us through the wall? Pause now if you want to try and answer it yourself first. The answer is probably not. If the enemy Bulgrin are able to melee us from this position, our tank is not going to be able to shoot the Bulgrin after our guys die or fall back. The Bulgrin are going to be completely safe. And we'll end up losing models for nothing in return. So what can we do to make this better for us? The answer is if we stand further back from the wall and the Bulgrin charge us, they're going to have to come onto our side of the wall. And even though our infantry are almost definitely going to die, we're going to be doing a lot more damage to them when the Rogel Dorn comes around and shoots them on the next turn. Because most of our infantry is so cheap and is really just OC and bodies to stand on places, almost anything our opponent is going to put into melee with our infantry is going to mean that we are going to trade up into these targets. Another thing that I actually learned from an Adeptus Sororitas player is making sure that we are pre-measuring ourselves such that we can guarantee that we are going to shoot back on the next turn. As an example here, the enemy Hellhound is poking out in such a way that it can barely draw a line of sight up against our infantry. So, one of the things that we can oftentimes do is make sure that it is not worth it for our opponent to try to actually shoot these infantry. We've pre-measured this such that the Rogel Dorn with a 10-inch move can move its sponson or move the tank in general into the same firing lane that our opposing Hellhound is in. This means that if the enemy Hellhound still wants to shoot our infantry, it's going to have to still be in this firing lane, and we are guaranteed to be able to shoot it back on the next turn. The more important part of this is not the execution of actually killing the Hellhound back. As long as we are telling our opponents this, a lot of the time our opponent will go, do I want to use this unit to kill the infantry? The answer will oftentimes be no, in which case we're going to be scoring 5 points or 4 points or whatever it is off of this primary objective. Because our opponent might think that allowing us to score the VP now is not worth trading away this unit. Let's go over a way to prevent our opponent from trading back. Again, this is very oversimplified, but 2 things to think about. 1, if you're going to kill something, you want to make sure that it's dead. So make sure you devote enough firepower to be very confident that something is going to die. In both these examples, if you drop at Scions A or at Scions B, the enemy Lord Lunar here is definitely going to die. It is just nowhere near durable enough to stand up to all this firepower. However, it becomes way more complicated when we start including more opposing units. In this example, the Rogel Dorn has switched teams and is now on the other side. We have to ask ourselves again, does it matter if we drop at Scions A or at Scions B? The answer is it matters a lot. In this example, if we were to drop at Scions A, yeah, we're still going to be killing this enemy Lord Lunar, but we're going to lose a lot of and probably the entire Scions unit immediately on the swingback. However, the enemy tank could never find a way to actually shoot Scions B, so we're going to want to try and drop here instead. Now, this is obviously an over-exaggerated example. However, there are lots of times where you can try and make sure that maybe our opponent can only shoot at us with 1 tank instead of with 2 tanks if we drop in a slightly different position. And those are the situations I want you to start looking for. Let's look at another example where we are not going to be letting our opponent kill more than they should be able to. In general, you don't want to let your opponent kill a transport and what's inside it in the same turn. So, you should generally be looking for opportunities to set up your transports such that your units, if the transport dies, can disembark into safety. Here's an easy example where by having the Chimera up against the wall, when it dies, and all the models inside are forced to disembark, they can now all go wholly within 3 inches of where the Chimera is when it dies. However, they're now entirely behind a wall, which means that our opponent very unlikely to be able to continue putting more damage into this target. It's even better if you can manage to do this in such a position where the Chimera will disengorge its contents, but put them onto an objective so that you can score it next turn. Let's talk about a couple more principles before we get to the advanced concepts. For people who have played 40k for a little bit longer, and at least remember 9th edition, there was this concept called bracketing, where once you hit certain health thresholds, your movement would degrade, and your ballistic skill would slowly get worse, meaning that everything was getting worse and worse to hit. This is technically still true in 10th edition, but it is so much less impactful than it was in 9th edition and previous editions. In 9th edition, you could lose up to 4 inches of movement and ballistic skill -2 when you were below a 3rd HP. Now, you're only -1 to hit, and for most models and most units, that's all that it does. This is the same penalty that we get for being tied up in combat. And ultimately, what this means is that bracketing in 10th edition is fake. You do not want to be chipping away at vehicles and monsters. That should almost never be the goal. If you're going to be chipping away at models, it should be because you have over-allocated. You have put 2 units that can kill 1 enemy unit, and the first one just killed the enemy unit entirely, and now you just have a second model start shooting. It's like, well, I guess I might as well put damage into that because there's no downside to doing so. It's nearly always way better to over-allocate resources to kill something than to under-allocate. You do not want to try and take gambles in this. This is part of why a lot of strong players have generally moved away from the Lehman Russ Demolisher. It is undeniably a good tank. However, because it is so inconsistent with the amount of damage that it is going to do, a lot of people do not like gambling on this kind of gun. Sometimes you're going to kill a knight in 1 activation. Other times, you're not going to do any damage to it at all. And I actually have a funny story. At the last RTT I played at, my opponent rolled 11 ones for damage over the course of the game because his Demolishers, his Meltas, and his last cannons just were not hitting the crucial targets. However, this is not true of multi-model units. And by multi-model units, I really just mean anything that has more than 1 model in it. There is some leeway here before I talk about this exact example. For instance, if you're shooting at a Primaris Crusader squad in Black Templars, a lot of the guys at the very beginning are just going to be swinging with chainswords. Losing these models is not going to be drastically decreasing their damage output. It really starts hitting them when you start killing their power fists. However, for a lot of units, it tends to be a bunch of models that are identical. An easy example is in World Eaters, losing 3 8-bound cuts the output of the unit in half. So if 6 8-bound slam into a unit of Bulgrin, they'll kill 2, which means that the remaining 4 Bulgrin will kill 1 8-bound on the swingback on average. However, if we kill 3 of the 8-bound first and then they charge into the Bulgrin, 3 8-bound are only going to kill 1 Bulgrin on average, which means that the remaining 5 Bulgrin are way more likely to kill a second 8-bound on the swingback. This is something that we oftentimes look for quite a bit, is making something combat ineffective. Killing a bunch of Marines out of a Chosen brick, or killing a bunch of members out of a Death Company brick, are great ways to make sure that these units are not scary when they're coming closer. This is mostly true of melee units, but there are some examples of shooting units as well, such as Space Marine Eradicators. So it's okay to do damage to units that have more than one model in them, especially if those models are identical. One of the ideas that you will sometimes hear about is the idea that you should trade units for things that cost more points than the unit that you're using to trade. And this is a good rule of thumb, but it really misses out on a lot of the nuance. One of the best examples I've seen was I played a game recently against a top Tau player, and he traded a unit of Star Size with Flamers for Gaunt's Ghosts. He was playing Retaliation Cadre and really wanted access to be freely deep striking around without spending 2 CP for the 3-inch deep strike, and Gaunt's Ghost is a fantastic screening tool. So even though he traded a unit that cost more points than Gaunt's Ghost did, it was one of the best trades he could have made because the Star Size didn't have any other good targets in my army. But if he could allow the rest of his army to be more flexible, it was a much better trade for him than it was for me. So instead of just thinking, how many points are my units worth, instead you need to be asking, how painful is it to lose this unit? Does this unit provide more utility for me or for my opponent? The number of points a unit costs is a starting point, but it is definitely not the end-all be-all. One of the other things to really think about is our opponent's shoot and scoot and reactive moves, because they really tend to screw up a lot of the calculations people make when they're trying to figure out how much damage they need to allocate into certain units to make sure they die. To start off with, armies like Eldar, Tau, and Gladius Marines can cheat the trading game by having pseudo-indirect. These armies have the ability to move a unit out, shoot, and then sometimes for a stratagem, sometimes built into their army, they can then retreat back behind a wall, and so they function like an indirect piece. The way to try and deal with these armies is you need to overload them with threats. Generally, they can only reactive move or shoot and scoot one of these things. So what we want to do with them is we want to give them too many things such that they can't actually use them to hide. If you choose to save this piece, it means you're going to be losing this piece instead. Other armies, like Space Wolves, Wolf Jail, Orcs, and World Eater Berserkers, can limit shooting output with blood surges. Generally, what this means is that if you shoot, they lose a model or lose a wound, depending on exactly the wording of the ability. After you're done shooting, they can move generally up to d6 inches. The biggest danger with this to keep in mind is a lot of these moves can end in engagement range, which would typically prevent us from shooting anything else into these units. The way to generally deal with these are 1. Prevent your opponent from having anything to blood surge into. By standing 7 inches away from something, d6 inches will never get them into engagement range. This means that even if they do take this reactive move, you can shoot them again. The other way to deal with this is by giving them targets that can still shoot after the blood surge. The best example for this in our army is Hellhounds, because Hellhounds have this really awesome flamer that is then going to be doing its normal shooting into this target anyway. While Hellhounds are the best, other things that are decent at this are things like Luminous Demolishers, Eradicators, and Chimeras, things that don't really mind if they are in combat because they're going to be firing at about the same effectiveness no matter what. The next major concept I want to put in your mind is generally we talk about the trading game in terms of taking away pieces from our opponent's army. However, something that you will start noticing more and more as you get better and better at 40k is trading for tempo. And tempo is yet again another chess term, which basically means time. Most things in a game of 40k can only activate or do things 5 times in a game. Less if they die earlier, sometimes more if they are useful in both the shooting phase and in the fight phase. However, if you can prevent units from moving to places they want to be for an entire turn, this can be a worthwhile trade. An easy example of this is I will trade my 55-point unit of Catachan and put it into your 150-point Predator in a charge. I'm not going to do any damage to you. However, because you cannot move into a position where you want to be, it's effectively dead for a turn. This is a major reason why nuisance charges are such a big part of 10th edition 40k. Another way to do this is you stand in front of units so they cannot shoot or melee targets that they want to. Because all the damage happens after the movement phase, something like orcs really hate having a line of Catachan standing 1 inch away from them because the only thing that they can do is charge into the Catachan. You can use both of these ideas to score extra primaries, score extra secondaries, because your opponents can never get to you to stop you from doing the things that you want. Another thing to be really aware of is consolidate moves. Consolidate moves are mostly threatening 2 different things. The first one is if you tag units, they're going to either not be able to shoot or they're going to shoot worse. This is really bad for guard because we're an army that does the bulk of our damage in the shooting phase. And if we're shooting at -1 to hit, or if we just can't shoot because it's not a vehicle, we've effectively lost a unit. Just like we said previously, if our unit can't do anything, it's effectively dead for a turn. The other major thing that we need to be aware of is allowing our opponent to consolidate to move out of line of sight. So, especially if there is a melee going on near an objective, be careful about how you pull models to make sure that your opponent cannot pull all of their models out of line of sight by doing a consolidate move after the fight phase is over. To avoid the first one, you need to keep an absolute minimum of a 4-inch distance between the front of your screens and the front of your tanks, and in practice, it's usually more than this. But that's not the topic of this video right now. The other thing, like we said, is make sure you're careful about fighting around objectives. If you're using a light unit like Catachan or Cadians near an objective and your opponent kills all of them, sometimes they'll be able to pull themselves out of line of sight. We want to make sure we can prevent this. The last major concept I want to put into your minds is understanding when you need to start engaging in the trading game. And a major part of this is keeping the mission that you're playing in mind. Just because your opponent is standing on an objective doesn't necessarily mean it's important to kill the units on that objective, and so we don't necessarily need to go for the trade right away. If you're playing on take and hold and your opponent is standing on 4 objectives, they're only going to score 3 of them. So it might not be as important if you can only kill them off of 1 of them, because they're still going to be scoring maximum primary anyway. However, on take and hold, with hidden supplies, it's very easy to score 50 primary if you're only holding your home objective on turns 1 and 2. So you don't necessarily need to extend yourself early on in the game. However, on a mission like Scorched Earth, you can only score a maximum of 40 points by standing on your home and the No Man's Land objective every turn. To score more than that, you would need to burn an objective. So, if you can stop your opponent 1 turn from standing on a No Man's Land objective, you limit the maximum primary that you can score this way from 40 points to 35 points. So if you can shoot them off of 1 No Man's Land objective on turn 2, it's going to effectively score you 5 points because it's a 5-point differential that you're building for yourself. Think a little bit more about what other missions are like this. Which ones do you need to stand on more than 1 objective in order to score, and are there ways to make sure your opponent cannot maximize their primary by killing them off of certain objectives? If no, maybe you don't need to kill them this turn. With all of this already addressed, I want to talk about a couple of upcoming plans for the channel. So, I am going on a month or so of a lot of GTs. Over the next 2 months, I'll be going to There Is Only War 3 in Phoenix, Arizona, the SoCal Open Teams event in San Diego, California. I'll be going back to San Diego November 8th for the California Cup, an 8-round event. And then I'm looking at going to the Battleshock GT and the Mad GT in late November, which are both up in San Francisco. I'm mostly looking for events that will have a minimum of 25 players that I can hopefully drive to. So there's going to be a lot of after-action reports about GTs coming up in the near future. One of the other videos I'm really looking to try to do is do a World Championships roundtable preview with some of the players who are looking to go. Let me know if that's something that interests you down in the comments. Also, with the new hotness that is the Tempestus Aquilons coming out, I will be doing an officer training school video on them in the next few weeks. However, it's going to take me a little bit of time to get some reps in and make sure I understand a lot of the nuances behind how effectively you can use this unit. But do know, I think they're very good, and I will absolutely be playing them, and we'll hopefully have something for you guys before the end of the month. Lastly, I want to give a shout out to everybody who's currently a member of the channel. The support means a lot to me. You guys are a bulk of the income of this channel, and it's really encouraging me to continue making more videos. If you want to be a member of the channel, you'll not only get access to videos early, but you'll also get access to our super secret part of the Discord, where you guys get to see me talk about things in ways that not everybody always gets to see. We get to talk about upcoming content, and you guys will also have access to me fairly directly, where you can ask for certain kinds of videos, and I'll pay a little bit more attention in that. With all that said, though, hopefully this video has been helpful about learning a little bit more about the trading game, how to conceptualize it in your mind, and maybe giving you a couple ideas on how you can actually effectively make this work in your own games. For now, this has been Joshua Joshi Howard. We've been talking about the trading game in 40K, specifically in relationship to how guard players play it. We'll make sure we see you guys all next time. Bye-bye.